title of the message today is Final Chapters or First Chapters. And of course that, in one sense, is the final chapters here of the book of Genesis. In another sense, we could look at this whole Bible and say, well, it's kind of still first chapters, like there's all this stuff that's coming afterwards. So we're just kind of getting started. But you even get that sense from the text. Remember, of course, it wasn't as though the book of Genesis was written at the time of the events. The book of Genesis was written hundreds of years later. So these events happened, and then this was all written down. And so as Moses writes this, he's not born for hundreds of years yet, but as he writes about these events, he wrote another 4 books that they're all, kind of in the same few years that he wrote these 5 books of Moses. And so this was very much, even for his contemporaries, kind of just setting things up for the next stage. And as you read, particularly these chapters, you very much get the sense that these things are being recorded for us to take with us into the future and to think about in the days ahead and to remember these events as they happened. And so that's sort of what I mean by the final chapters or first chapters. Just to remind ourselves where we are here, Genesis chapter 48, 49, and 50. At this point, Jacob is nearing death on his bed in Egypt. Before he dies, he will set his house in order for the final time. First, in chapter 48, we read about Joseph visiting his father, and his father using the occasion to confer a special honor and blessing upon Joseph, sort of as a reward for all that Joseph had done. The sermon title for that message that I had taught was Jacob Rewards Rachel's Righteous Son, right? And so this is what this is about, this first chapter 48. In chapter 49, we read about a gathering of the entire family of Jacob. So chapter 48 was sort of maybe an unexpected but welcomed visit from Joseph and his sons. Due to his failing father's health, he got word of it, and this chapter 48 happens. And in that time, he seeks to bless Joseph in a special way. Then in chapter 49, it's more kind of the official time, like it really is the end now, and everyone comes gathered together. At least all of the sons of Jacob are there for the purpose of prophesying over them and declaring to them what shall happen to them in the days ahead. This is a very unusual chapter in the Bible, and it ends with Jacob's death and the events surrounding that. Then third, in chapter 50, we read about Joseph's reaction to his father's death, this honored burial in Canaan. We read about the fears of Joseph's brothers after all that's transpired, now that Dad's gone. Maybe part of why, maybe the reason their fear is, maybe the reason Joseph has been so gracious to us is because he knows it would upset his father to enact revenge. And now that Dad's gone, I don't think it is, but maybe this has been a show from Joseph. And so they do all they can to appease him and to earn his favor. Of course, they already had it, but that plays out, and we read about that. And then finally, we read about the death of Joseph himself and what happens to his body after his death. And then that kind of whole generation, the influential people of that generation, and all that pre-slavery time is kind of over, and Genesis ends. All of that is an odd way to end a book about your history as a people, but again, Moses wrote 5 books. This is just the first one. It's part 1, and it's a good spot to end at the end of the life of Joseph. The next book opens up and quickly summarizes the next 400 years and then narrates closely and in close detail all the events surrounding Israel's departure from Egypt and being made slaves for so long a time. So what I want to do today then is consider these 3 chapters at the end of Genesis, to review them, remind ourselves of what's in them and how they contribute to what we're supposed to take from Genesis. So that's where we'll be. Moses intended the people of God to always be able to draw lessons from this book and even these chapters, whether they would be his contemporaries who were walking around in the desert, or the next generation entering the promised land, or the hundreds of generations who would live after that one, who would seek to know what God is doing in the world. This extends so far, Jesus could even say, Moses wrote of me. Right? So Moses so intended for ongoing generations to draw lessons from his book that he's writing about things that even have to do with the Lord Jesus Christ directly. And so he writes for everyone in that sense. Now, Genesis chapter 48 then, verses 1 through 22. Jacob is rewarding Rachel's righteous son. We need to remember just a couple recent points in the story as we dive in. I've got 5 quick things I want to say here. There was a severe regional famine, and Joseph's brothers made their way to Egypt, where Joseph had stored up food against the famine. There, they unwittingly bow to their now ruling brother and submit to Joseph. He recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. As a result, he puts them through a whole series of tests to discern what they are made of, and after all these many years, and also he wants to confront them with their past while still concealing his own identity from them for the present time. That plan succeeds wonderfully. Eventually, he can see that his brothers have in fact, even if maybe only recently, have in fact changed, and they are genuinely contrite for their previous sins, and he reveals to them, himself to them, and sends for his father so that the whole family can take refuge in the shadow of his protection and provision. God has sent him down to Egypt in these circumstances, as difficult as they were, in order to unite the family together and to protect and provide for the family in Egypt before they will eventually return to the land promised them by God. As the famine goes on, the people of Israel gain wealth and status for Joseph's sake because of his good service to the Egyptians. The Egyptians, meanwhile, as part of that Egyptian system, as not as outsiders, find themselves answering to the Egyptian authorities, not being favored by them, but rather answering to them and dealing with them. And under Joseph's plan, they are, thankfully, to their benefit, saved from death. But the whole famine is so severe that it costs them dearly, and they make it through the famine with little but their lives. Some 12 years after that famine is over, this chapter 48 opens up. And now at the end of his life, Jacob is weak and has now taken a turn for the worse. And the curtain's open. And here we are, chapter 48, 12 years after the end of the famine. First 7 verses, what do we read? Joseph visits his father. Let's just begin to read some here. After this, Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is ill." So he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And it was told to Jacob, "Your son Joseph has come to you." And then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. You're pretty weak, right, if you have to summon your strength to sit up in bed. I've been there like a day or 2 in my life. But, I mean, here he is, summons his strength to sit up in bed. He's probably pillowed up in bed. Later it talks about these boys being brought to his knees, and we can miss the timeline and think they're little children, toddlers on Grandpa's knees, but Grandpa can't get up in bed, really, and these are grown men. So they're they're grown. He had these children before his brothers came down and the family came down in the midst of the famine. There were a number of years left in the famine. And it's 12 years after that. Like, these guys are, early 20s probably. So they're not sitting on Grandpa's knee, and especially if he's weak. So we get that out of our head. So here we are. It was told to Jacob, "Your son Joseph has come to you." Then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty." So now Jacob has something he wants to say here. He gives a speech to Joseph. Maybe he's glad for the visit. He wants to say some things to him. "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and blessed Luz." That's Bethel. Remember, that's Bethel. Remember, it was Luz at the first, but now it's called Bethel. So, "appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples. and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. So you remember again, now even in his mind is again this thing God promised me, not just that I'd be fruitful and multiply, but that my descendants would be a company of peoples. We'd all be together, joined together, united. And this is what God, and I couldn't believe it would happen, but it's happened. And so he says, and now your 2 sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. I'm going to make them mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. And the children that you fathered after them shall be yours, and they shall be called by the name of their brothers and their inheritance. As for me, when I came from Padan, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. This is a hard thing to hear, no doubt. He has, there is a certain logic to what he's laying out here, his desire to give this, to bless and to give this blessing today. There's 4 considerations in a conclusion, 4 reasons. First of all, there was this promise of God concerning our future. God promised we would have this future together. Or we would have this, God, I will make you fruitful and multiply you. I'll give you this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession, these promises. But there's also the second consideration. We had to be united. God said we would be a company of peoples. We had to be together or this could never happen. Third consideration, kind of in the background here, is the goodness of Joseph and all the suffering that he underwent in Egypt. And that he was, in his character, because of his character, he was the instrument by which these promises have come to pass. He mentions his time in Egypt. And the fourth consideration, which seems odd and out of place, is he just says at the end of verse 7, as for me, when I came from Padan, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And you think this seems like it has nothing to do with blessing Joseph now. But the idea is people live with regrets, and what happens is when they have those regrets, if they learn from them, they refuse to do that kind of thing again. And the idea is, this is a regret that he has, is that Rachel died prematurely. It's a painful thing that he's experienced. And now he's nearing death, and he's saying, there's some things I want to do before I die, and I'm not going to miss out on that. And there's people that I've wanted to honor all my life in different ways. And like I always wish Rachel had more kids, and she could have been honored in society maybe even more by others who knew her. Maybe didn't know her like I knew her, didn't appreciate her like I did. Whatever, those kinds of things. And now he sees Joseph and he says, look, you've done all these things. And I remember, Rachel, and what happened with your mother, and I'm not going to let this happen again. I'm going to honor you, and I want to bless you. And so this is what's going to happen. That's why I'm doing it. And so you just kind of get a sense of this scene. Therefore, I want to grant you a double portion in this very unusual way. I'm not going to give you the birthright because, and you might think, well, why? He's earned it. Well, there are others ahead of him who are deserving of it. It's not that they're more deserving of it, but they haven't done anything to lose it, and they've actually done some wonderful things. And we'll see the one who gets that is Judah. But he does want to bless him, and the way he seeks to bless him is, I'm going to take your 2 sons and make them my sons. I'm going to bless them in this way. I'm going to bless them in that way here today. So it's an interesting way to do this. They're going to get 2 tribal allotments, not 1. That's the way this is going to happen in the land. They're going to share in the inheritance with all the other brothers as though they're equal. It's a remarkable thing. So then he begins this ceremony in verse 8, and he begins it, but it's kind of we might call it the unofficial beginning of this ceremony. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "And who are these?" And of course, he knew who they were. So Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons whom God has given me here." And he said, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. So you just think, wait a minute, I thought he saw his sons. Now it says he can't see. And then it's getting ready to say in a minute, he said, he's going to tell them that he saw them again. We know his eyes are failing him, among many other things failing him, but he can't see well. And so he brings them near to him so he can really look at them, right? We all know what that's like. It's one thing to people are kind of fuzzy over there. You know who they are, but you'd like to actually lay eyes on them and see them. And so they come near. And he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your offspring also." Right? He thought he was dead. And here he is alive, and even children are before him. You can imagine the joy in this blessing, this scene, how full of joy he is. So Joseph prepares what he can. He knows his dad wants to do this, so what does he do? Joseph removed them from his knees, so took them from that place, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. And Joseph then took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand. So there's two boys. One of the things Israel is going to have to do is know which one is older, so he knows how to properly do this. So Joseph does, according to what custom would be, puts the oldest on what would be his father's right hand and the youngest on what would be his father's left hand, kind of helping him out. It's what you do for old people who are having trouble getting around and things. You set things up so that they can't fail. Like just go straight, and like, okay, stop. Let me get this door. Stand still. Now walk straight again. It's like this is how you help them. And so this is what he does. And so that ought to also give us a sense of how bad Joseph's eyes are, how weak and frail he is. He's going to do everything to make it easy. And then the other idea, he's up in bed, so likely maybe one on each side of the bed or whatever, or it's not it's not a king-size bed, it's just a bed, right? But he can put his hands there. But his bed's narrow enough that he's able to switch his hands and still do this, But so it's this sort of a thing, bring them up in this way, so he doesn't have to move around and change positions and do all this stuff. You can just make it as easy as you can for him. And this is what Joseph sets out to do. And so he brings them near him. In verse 14, and Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, so this is his blessing to Joseph. What's the blessing? It's a reward for Joseph for his righteous character and all that he's in his deeds. But the blessing is to bless his sons after him. The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys, and in them let my name be carried on, in the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. That's a pretty significant blessing, for sure. When Joseph saw that his father had laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, and he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. So he grabs the hand, even physically grabs it, right? But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. And Joseph said to his father, not this way, my father, since this one's the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. So he tells him, no. And what does Jacob say? But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nonetheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them that day, saying, now he speaks to the boys directly, by you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh, and as Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. So, this is interesting. You remember in the life of Abraham, when God told him that Ishmael would not be the one and to send him away. Of course, in those occasions, we find Abraham pleading for Ishmael, especially the first time. Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. And then, but God says, I've heard you, and I'll make of him a great nation. He'll be a great people too. Don't worry about it. But this isn't for him. the temptation is to read this text kind of in the same way. That Jacob says, I know, he'll also become a people, he'll be great, it's okay, he can kind of have his own thing. But that's not what happens. He actually, with both hands extended, pronounced the blessings of Abraham on them both. They both get it. It's not different blessings. It's the same blessing. So it's kind of, in another sense, it's like, well, what are we arguing about? Well, there's some significance to the right hand and the left hand. That's what he's arguing about. And you might say it this way, it's the difference between the right hand and the left hand is you only get to underline one blessing, and you have to underline one of them. Or it's like, Ephraim gets the blessing pronounced in all capitals, and Manasseh just gets it in all lowercase. It's the same blessing, but it's kind of, one gets the better part of it. Not that we're going to hack it to pieces and you get this sentence and I get that phrase and you get that part of it and I get this part of it, but it's all for both of you, but one of you kind of get a little bit more of it, is the idea. And so that should, he said, no, don't do that. He says, don't worry. He is still going to get all this. It's just this one's going to be first. This one's going to be. And so then he turns around and to secure the deal, he gives this statement, by you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh. It's a done deal, Joseph. It's amazing. And every sibling pair ever since would want to be the first name, And God make you as, it's like, do I get first billing or second billing? Yeah, you're second billing. So this is what Jacob did. It's a bit of an odd thing that he did. And you wonder kind of why he did it. And you just have to wonder if it wasn't, he's seen this in his family so many times. It was him over Esau, and then he's got his sons, and it's Joseph and then Benjamin who were born last, right? And then even in Judah, it was Perez who made a breach, and it's just like, it's always, it's these sorts of things, you start out first, you may not end first, and it's not as though Israel as a nation decided, oh yeah, this is the way it should be from now on, we're always going to have the second one be first. They didn't do that, but for some reason he decided to do that here. And he made him first, made the younger one first. And he did it in the context of a blessing he wanted to give to his son. And so I can't help but think, but it's partly poetic justice in the sense of it was my final sons who were the most righteous, who were the best, who were the greatest, who redeemed us, who saved us, who served us faithfully, who forgave and made all of this possible. We owe him so much. And so when I bless him, I can't do it in a way that doesn't acknowledge the younger over the olders. And so I want to give him the same blessing, but I want to just acknowledge that it was the younger one. And that seems to me to be the significance of this and why it mattered to him. Even though he didn't really mean to make much distinction, he just wanted to make that distinction at least, to honor the reality of how his son had been positioned within the family and all the blessing that had come from it. Then there's one final reward for Joseph here in this chapter. Verse 21, then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you, rather than to your brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. I think, again, why give this to Joseph and not his brothers? Because you're rewarding him for what he's done. Why this location? It meant so much to him. If you actually think of this, if you believe that you as a family, that your descendants are going to inherit this massive region, like you would say, you might want to give to your son like the best area that's there. And that doesn't seem to be what it is, because it's not what he says. He doesn't say, I've given to you rather than to your brothers the mountain slope where all the choicest fruits, and vegetables are grown, and, that's watered so wonderfully in this valley, and that's your spot. He says, rather, the mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. It's like this place, it's the only place in the promised land he conquered something. He took a little part of that. There was this battle, and it's amazing. It doesn't, when you think about how old he was when they came back as a family from Padan Aram, how unlikely it is that Jacob was out fighting wars. But he found himself in a place at one time where in his age, he was out there and he was out there in a battle and he won and he got the land. His sons weren't fighting, he did it with my sword and my bow. And he's like, that, it's not a lot, but that spot, when I chased those guys out of there and I killed that guy who did such and such, that's going to you. You get that. It's amazing. Like, that's what he gives him, and he gives it to Joseph, and it's wonderful. But it's an interesting thing. All we know is that I took it from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and my bow. But you just can't imagine him taking anything from anyone. He wasn't as old then as he is now, but he was an old man. But he did it, and he wants this particular son to have it. What else does he have to give him? I mean, think about your Jacob. What else could you possibly give this boy? Like, you owe him everything. You got to give him something. Well, I'll give you this. I'll bless you in this way. I'll bless your sons. And I'll give you this piece of land. So that's that chapter. I had some application I wanted to make, and I made it back at the time, and I wanted to just remind us again. 2 main points. Number 1, it is right for us to honor those that God has used in our life to bless us and provide for us, especially when the blessing and provision they get that has come our way has involved their suffering and great difficulty for them. When it's come at a cost to them, and when they've shown strength of character and faith in God in their efforts, we ought to honor them as Christians. Whether that be when we have specific texts, whether it be godly shepherds, or whether it be missionaries, whether it be really anyone to whom respect and honor is owed, we ought to honor them. This is something it's under the surface here, but as I've read through here, surely you see it. This is under the surface entirely in this chapter. As Jacob thinks about Joseph and what he's done, his desire is to honor him. And this is a right thing. God will honor those who love others the way that Joseph did. And we should do so as well. Second, that's one application. Second application. We can and should act with confidence upon the promises of God for our future, even though we don't see how those promises will ever get to the place of fulfillment. It's not as if, even when we see in chapter 49 all these blessings that are these futures that are foretold to the people of Israel, it's not as if Jacob has a clear sight of the path that everyone will take and how these things will happen. But he's certain of this future, and he acts in confidence upon that, even though he sees no clear path to make it happen. Right? So there are things that we could say, like we kind of skip this in our thinking a lot of times as Christians. But I mean, because we think, well, the promises we have in mind are, a new heavens and a new earth. And we don't think about the difficulty of that because we think, well, I mean, Jesus is going to come down in a display of the power of God. He's just going to do it. And we're going to be amazed. And that's kind of all we're looking for. But understand, like, God's made you lots of promises in His Word, and many of those promises, it's not clear at all how God's going to fulfill this thing or that thing. It's not clear. But He will. And you can just act in confidence upon it. And this is a wonderful thing. Like, we have, remember when we were going through with the younger children that material on the promises of God? We had a wall full of it. I understand we took it down, but maybe we put it back up or something. I don't know, but it doesn't have to be up. But remember, the effect was for the kids to see promise after promise after promise after promise that are their promises. Like, they could claim these things. God has promised this. All those things, like, you don't have to know. It doesn't have to look like God's going to fulfill it for you to act as though He will. Because He will. These are His promises. And this is the way, it's amazing for Israel to say to Joseph, I'm going to give you that slope of land. Like, what makes you think it's going to be available for the taking? What makes you think he's just going to be able to go get it? What if there's giants in the land? I mean, what if? Well, who cares? God's going to do it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what those obstacles are. He's just confident. And so we can and should act in the same way. Like, what things has God promised us, are we certain and sure of? Act accordingly, right? It's as though Jesus says to the disciples, where's your faith? Right? They're in the boat, they're all, we're going to die. And like, they had specific reasons to know that wasn't going to happen to them. They turned to him, Lord, don't you care? And it's like, if I am who all of you have professed me to be, what are you worried about? Gets up and just, shh, and it's all done. Where's your faith? And this is the way it is. So that's the second application from that chapter. Now, chapter 49. We will not read every verse in this chapter simply because to read them invites the question, this is the blessing. One, what does it mean? And then two, how is it fulfilled? And we went through all that before, and I don't think in this review the helpful aspect of this for us would be to finding out, and rehearsing, this is specifically what was promised, this is specifically how it was fulfilled. So I want to draw your attention to some other details in this chapter as we work through chapter 49. It's a curious one. We read about a custom that we no longer have, the sort of end-of-life blessing of children. It's not particularly common or known in the West. We do have times when we gather loved ones together when death is near, but usually it's to say goodbyes, maybe to reconcile, one last chance to reconcile, or just to be there with the family when an important family member is passing, just to show a solidarity. We're all in this together. We're family. We're here. That's very different than gathering around the family patriarch as he, with all his heart and mind, doles out blessings upon the family for their future, invoking the help of God to bring about these pronouncements. These are sacred times. That was the typical custom. But this is even different than that. There are some startling differences in this scene with what was commonly practiced in these situations. First of all, he says, Then Jacob called his sons and said, Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come. What they would have expected would be, gather yourselves together to receive the blessings that I have for you for your futures. Instead, he says, that I may reveal to you what will happen to you in the future. It's like, well, how do you know what's going to happen to us in the future? Well, Hebrews 11:21 tells us Jacob did this by faith. God had showed him, which is remarkable. Look down to verse 28. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each with the blessing suitable to him. So it's kind of two things. It's both a blessing suitable to the son and to the tribe, but it's also a foretelling of what he knows will come to pass. And in that way, it's very unusual. It's unique. It's not like what would typically be done. This is not the blessing he's decided, but it's the future he sees from this distance. These are not his dying wishes. He's not settling scores. He's not getting revenge. It's not even his rewarding of favorites. It's his faithfully passing on what he's seen from God. He is a man constrained by fatherly love to disclose to his descendants what it is that God has shown to him about their future in the land to which they will one day go. And therefore, there is an added importance that they pay attention carefully to the words he now declares. So again, this is a time of handing out blessings, but more than that, this is a time in which God is declaring to the people of Israel, through their patriarch himself, a prophecy concerning their futures together. Now, the ordering of these declarations, or these prophecies, you might call them, are by mother, not by birth order exclusively, but by mother. The first 6 sons of Leah almost all in order, except the last two are switched. Issachar and Zebulun are switched, which is strange. We're never given a reason why, but those two are switched in terms of birth order. But all those sons of Leah. And then, remember, in history, in real history, the way this happened, then next, Rachel's servant had two sons. And then Leah's servant had two sons, and then Rachel had two sons. Well, sorry. Then Leah had a couple more boys, and then Rachel had two sons. But if we're just taking who was the first woman to conceive, well, it'd be Leah. It goes through all her sons. And then the next one would be Bilhah. Well, it goes to Bilhah next. But it just does one of her two sons. Just, which one was it? Dan? Okay. Yep, and then Asher was after. Yeah, so, or Naphtali, after. So, it's strange. So you give her, and then we do the servants of Leah, her two sons, and then we go back to Rachel's maidservant's other son, Naphtali, and then we come back finally and end with Rachel's two sons, Joseph and Benjamin. Just a weird order. The structure of the statements that are made. Mostly these statements are short and brief. 7 of them, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Benjamin, are all very short. 3 of them are non-blessings with a judgment included. Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. And that just leaves 2 more that don't fit those categories, Judah and Joseph. And both of these are lengthy blessings to these men. And if I were to ask you, if we were to stop at Genesis chapter 47 and say, if Jacob was going to give a particular blessings to some of his sons, which ones do you think they would be? Well, we would all mention Joseph, and then we would probably next mention maybe Benjamin and Judah, and that would kind of be it. Like there wouldn't be any more candidates really after that for receiving a special blessing. And Joseph and Judah are the ones that get it. And so, anyway, that's it. And just for us to understand that those 2 men get it. Now, I do want to highlight a couple things. I want to highlight Joseph and Judah. Also, though, I want to highlight Reuben briefly and Simeon and Levi. So let's look at Reuben for a moment. Reuben, you are my, verse 3, you are my firstborn, my might, and the firstfruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. And you might say, but unstable as water. You shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. And he turns to the others. He went up to my couch. Right? Which their couch isn't like we think of as a couch. It kind of is, but it was used for different purposes. Like you'd sleep on your couch. It was another word for your bed. But so here it is. Now, I won't go into detail about that event. We've discussed it in the past. But think of this now. For Reuben, his sin, though forgiven personally, that sin has ongoing consequences, and overlooking it now would be to treat it with less than the seriousness it requires. He sought to usurp the leadership of the family and to take his position as firstborn way before the time, completely out of order, in a terribly sinful way, and in a way that would bring utter shame and disgrace to his father. Like you don't start a nation forgiving those kinds of sins or treating them as inconsequential. You can forgive them on a personal basis, but there has to be a consequence for that. It's the blessing of the firstborn, the right of the firstborn, the birthright skips right over him, and in the blessing it's told exactly, like, look, you're my firstborn, my might, the fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. But unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence. Because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. And he doesn't receive that blessing. And then Simeon and Levi together. That's an odd one too. That they're together here. Everyone else is it's son by son, but these 2 are together. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Now, I said we weren't going to look at the fulfillment of these things, but I want to, in their case, to say just a couple things. In Joshua chapter 19, when all the inheritance of the land was being divvied up, this is amazing now, think of this. He said, Simeon and Levi won't get their own place, and they're just going to be scattered around. But Simeon does end up with a place. But it's amazing, it says, now the allotment for Judah was so big, they couldn't possibly occupy all of it. So some of the cities they gave to Simeon, and Simeon got a little bit of inheritance within Judah. This place over here and that place there. And it was kind of an area, but just, they were given these couple cities and the villages that surround there. So they didn't really get anything. Even though they weren't exiled from the nation, they were part of it, but they didn't get their own place. This is Judah's, but it's like Judah says, hey, man, Dad gave me so much, we can't possibly use it all. You need some, and I'll just be kind and you can have some of this over here. But he didn't really get it. So that was fulfilled. But in a way that's more gracious than you would think when you read this. It sounds like they don't have any part, but that's not the case. That wasn't the intention, wasn't to give them no part, but to not an equal part. They weren't going to receive an inheritance the same way all the other brothers would. Something would be withheld for their violent ways. And what else? What about Levi? Well, you wouldn't have guessed reading this that, we could say, well, the tribes of Levi, yeah, they were scattered. They had a town here and a town here and little cities that they could have scattered throughout Israel. But that's not and so that was fulfilled, but that's not the whole story. Understand, the Levites become the priestly tribe. They become the one entrusted with the presence of God. And the people, you wouldn't have guessed that. This isn't writing them off and excising them from the nation. But it is having very specific consequences for what they've done. You understand this, again, this isn't a personal matter between Jacob and his sons. It's what he sees will come to pass. These things happened. Well, why doesn't he tell them that they're going to get to become priests? He didn't see it, probably. Or if he did, he knew it wasn't for them to know now. It was something that happened in response to a later event that happened later in their history. And so this is what we get. And so I just want to mark that out here, that there, even the negative, the non-blessing futures that are foretold are very much they're very different. There are consequences. Reuben, it's more negative. Simeon and Levi, it's negative, but there's still plenty of good that comes to them. They're still very much part of this nation. So with that said then, let's go down to verses 8 through 12 and look at Judah. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Now just think visually what that looks like. Your hand shall be on the neck of, and I want you to visualize all this because every phrase is meant to be visualized. It's meant to convey a concept. Your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you, which is like what had happened for Joseph. Judah is a lion's cub, and from the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as a lioness, who dares rouse him? The scepter, that is the ruling staff, the staff that represents the kingship, shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Binding his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine, he has washed his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. What a blessing. But much of this blessing has to do with the right to rule being preeminent. All the things that Reuben could have had or should have had but didn't. That Reuben, if you were to look at all the men, it seems like you would pick him to be in charge if you just looked at them, because he's preeminent in, it says, firstborn, my might, the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity, preeminent in power. He walked into a room and everybody noticed, right? You had something that you needed somebody strong to do. Well, Reuben could do it, no problem. This guy, this was the way. But all these things have come to Judah. He's like a lioness. Who dares to rouse him? Right? He'll rule until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. The success that he's going to have, binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He's washed his garments in wine and his vesture in the blood of grapes. There will be a beauty upon him and his descendants after him. Not necessarily physical beauty, but it's conveyed in that way. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth are whiter than milk. Right? This is imagery that we find similar to like in the Song of Solomon, right? It's this, you have white teeth. It's like, we all want that, but we don't tend to think of that as like, oh, that's so beautiful. But it was a little more rare even then, right? So, okay, so this comes to him. It's very much kind of a blessing of the firstborn. You're going to be in charge. You're going to rule. You're going to reign. You're going to have the best of all of it. But Joseph, it's a little bit different. Look at verse 22. Joseph is a fruitful bow by a spring. His branches will run over the wall. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Right? Which is a comment rather not about the tribe of Joseph, but about the people of Israel. It's not surprised that the mighty one of Jacob would have sustained him, because it's from there that there's the stone of Israel is from here. By the God of your father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb, the blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. What a blessing. It's amazing. I feel like what this blessing is, as I read it, I hope you get this sense too, is it's sort of with all his heart. It's the highest personal blessing he could give. All the created good he's got, he blesses his son Joseph. All that he's come to experience of the goodness of our great God, that God might let him just pass on to his son and to his descendants. Let it be for you. You should have it. You should have it. Those are these blessings. Notice in this generation, I've mentioned it already, but the blessings of Abraham, even though it is mentioned briefly in summary form here. The blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents. He talks about that. Otherwise, the blessings of Abraham aren't specifically mentioned by name like that here. Instead, these blessings go out to all of them. It's assumed that this is for all of them. It's a noticeable difference between other generations of this family and the way this has worked. This is unique. One commentator said this about this whole chapter, and having gone through a little bit of it, it's a good way to summarize it. In blessing his sons, Jacob foretold what would befall each of them and their descendants in the latter days. He disqualified Reuben for the birthright because of sin, and Simeon and Levi because of violence, but gave kingship to Judah, an extensive blessing to Joseph, while briefly declaring the other sons' fortune in life and in the days ahead. So that's chapter 49, all the way up until we've read verse 28 as well. Now then, what do we draw from this? What conclusions and applications do we make from this chapter? What's the punch for us? Well, think of it this way. think about, and we didn't go through all the details, but I hope you remember them, and if you don't, you can go back and listen. But imagine what God was able to what God was able to declare about the future of all these tribes, and then what He faithfully fulfilled and carried out. Like He said He was going to do these things hundreds of years later. Yep, that's exactly what happened. This is remarkable. You got to be sure that as these things happened, the people of God were supposed to gain real confidence in how rock solid God's words and promises were. It's amazing. I mean, you imagine if there was some guy when our country was founded that said, listen, God has shown me these things. This is what's going to happen. And He said all these things. And now, we're not even far enough removed from that yet that these things would be happening. We're just a few hundred years apart from the founding of our country. I watched a video with the kids the other night in the older kids lesson where some guy was talking about, 400 years ago. It was like 400 years ago, people were still on he said, according to the date when he was given this, he said, we were still on, the pilgrims were still on their way over here. A lot can change in 400 years, he said. Can you imagine? Pilgrims still on their ships, 400 years ago, what we're talking about? We're talking about more than 400 years ago, usually 500-600 years before these things are all kind of worked out. And this is exactly what God had said would happen. This would be wonderfully encouraging for you as someone who's following God. It's meant to have that effect. Everything He said would come to pass came to pass. So then those things that God has declared will happen, but haven't yet happened, well, be confident. Rest assured. You also ought to have a real reverence for God Himself in everything. I mean, here, hundreds of years ago, God said this thing would happen. It's yeah, but it didn't really, most of those things happened, but not all of it. No, everything happened. When God speaks, we've got to listen. His words are the things which determine reality, not the other way around. What a thing. All right, now, moving on then. Chapter 49, verse 29, on through to the end here. We're kind of going to work through this. This final chapter of Genesis, it's a little bit more than that, right? Chapter 49, verse 29 to the end. But in this final section, we read about the death of two men, and we read about the specific instructions these men gave concerning their bodies for burial. It's interesting, both men had given specific instructions. First, we read about Jacob, and we read an account of his death and the fulfilling of his desire to be laid to rest in the cave his grandfather had purchased as a burial place for the family. Then we read about Joseph's final days and his request to be buried one day also in the same place. In both instances, we're considering the actions of two men who are at this point in time full of faith, full of confidence in God's Word and God's promise to them and to their family. Here's the idea. We come to this point, and their actions reflect a real confidence of what God will do and a real sense of solidarity with the rest of their family. It appears that the two main challenges to God's promises in the generation of Jacob's sons have been overcome. Remember, first of all, his sons did not follow God in faith. They were, some of them, like their uncle Esau, openly hostile, disinterested in the program of God. Judah, remember, had left. This challenge was met and answered by God with the repentance of Judah and also a change of character in all the sons of Jacob concerning one another. They began to love one another. The repentance of these men at large concerning their wickedness toward Joseph, all of that has been changed, and they're now together. Or they're now, at least their hearts are united. But secondly, the family wasn't together in solidarity under God. They weren't prepared to receive God's blessing because most of them, the most loved one among them, namely Joseph, was hated, was sold off as a slave to be forgotten forever. But God preserved him, used him to save the life of all of his family, earned in their eyes an honor that they had refused him before, but now they saw him as worthy of it. And after his death, the entire larger family continues to honor him and count him as a treasured ancestor, preserving his bones for hundreds of years. God has overcome all these things. It's wonderful. Now, God had used these men in unexpected ways, in unimaginable ways, to position His people to fulfill His purposes for them, to bring them to a certain place in heart, in mind, in desire, physically to be in a certain place. All these things, He'd worked these things out. But they're about to die and be off the scene. And before they go, it's kind of their final acts as they act in ways as to galvanize their descendants as best they can in hoping for and looking for the fulfillment of what God had yet promised. Their goal is to say things, to make them swear oaths, to vow to them, to promise that they will set their sights not on Egypt, but they set their sights on the promised land and all the promises that God has given them and the purposes of God for the world in the future. This is what they seek to do. That's their purpose. Now, let's just read chapter 49, verse 29. Then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field at Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abram bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept for him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming, and the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. 70 days. We're told, historians tell us, that this was just 2 days less than they mourned for the pharaohs. So they honored him like to the full extent you could without insulting Pharaoh. And it's curious that Joseph commands the Egyptians to embalm his father. You'd think, why would you do that? My only thought on that is this, if you're curious about it, is there has always been, and I think it rightly should be, for Christians, for anyone who has a hope in the resurrection and what's going to come, a certain reverence for the body. And I don't mean to say then certain practices are necessarily better than others. I'm not for embalming, right, necessarily. I'm not saying one thing or another. I'm not saying any of that. I'm not against cremation. I'm not saying any of those things. What I'm saying is this, is that in our time, in our culture, in our days, where we find ourselves, there will be certain things we could do for this body that seem to honor it, and other ways that we could act that would dishonor that body. And it seems like Joseph is at this point he's seen enough of these embalments and the way the Egyptians honor their dead, and he knows their false religion and those things, and he's not interested in that part of it. And it seems like some of those things were not done. But he wants his father's body cared for a certain way. And so he commands them to embalm his father. It could even just be, as he envisions the idea of burying his father, he wants his father not to be rotting. He doesn't want the trip. They're not going to go out in the backyard and do this. They don't live near this place. This is going to be a long time from now. Even if they left now, it would be some matter of time before they got there where they could bury the body. They're going to have to treat the body in some way. Well, why don't we do this? This is better. This will work better. Let's embalm it. And so they embalm Israel. 40 days are required to do it. That's how many are required for embalming, it says. The Egyptians wept for him 70 days. They didn't weep for Joseph that long, it says. They wept for Jacob. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh. So he speaks to the household of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die in my tomb that I hewed for myself in the land of Canaan. Sorry, my father made me swear, I'm about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore let me please go up and bury my father. Then I will return. Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father as he has made you swear. There's a parallel here with Exodus, and I want to bring it out, even though it's not necessarily directly a message, a lesson here, but it is a comparison we ought to make. When this Pharaoh who knows Joseph, and Joseph says, listen, all of us people of Israel who are serving you, and you're just prospering because of our service, you need to let us go. And we're going to go take care of this family matter, and we'll come back. And Pharaoh says, go. But this is denied the people of Israel later in the book of Exodus when they seek to go out. They say, look, we'll go out. We're going to worship God. We'll come back. And he says, no, you're not going to go. It's amazing. The way that God has used the honor of Joseph for the good of his people, even all the way through Joseph's life and many years afterwards. So Joseph went up, verse 7, to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, which is kind of, they get to the entrance of the Jordan River, kind of place they're overlooking all this, they're ready. They lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them, for his sons carried him to the land of Canaan, and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, what do they say? They say, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did for him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, Please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now, that's what Dad said, and now we're asking, Please forgive the transgression of your servants of the God of your father. We could ask, did Jacob ever say such a thing? We don't have it recorded, but I got to believe the men have changed enough now that they're not making it up. And I also think that Joseph kind of hears something of the voice of his father and what they say. It's believable to him. One man keenly pointed out had this to say about Joseph, says Joseph wept when they spoke to him. He wept because they felt they needed a mediator. They sent others to go talk. He wept because they're afraid of him. He wept because they believe he may be out for revenge. Like, how can you think that even now? And he wept, again, because he recognizes his father's voice and what they say, that Dad, too, knew this could possibly be an issue. And so he weeps. His brothers also then, once he weeps and they kind of hear that, oh, he's broken, they come and fell down before him and say, Behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said, think of this instance. I mean, here again, they're bowed before him. How different this is. They all had when he had the dream, there was this vision, and they all kind of had their own ideas of what that would be like. And they thought bowing before their brother would mean he's going to take advantage of them, the same way they would take advantage of their brothers if they were in charge. Would mean kind of submitting to his abuse and him taking things from them and all of this. And instead, it's forgiveness, it's reunion, it's love, it's all of this. It's so wonderful. They come and fell down before him and said, Behold, we are your servants. And Joseph said to them, Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. And thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. So this is the way it remained. He and his father's house remained in unity. They remained continuing to be provided for by him for all of his days. It's remarkable. This matter of what he says in chapter 50, verse 20. As for you, you meant evil against me, and God meant it for good. You know, it's such a kind of a bald statement. It's just bare. He doesn't explain all these details about it. But when you think about the person saying it, it means so very much. It's not just, this isn't a theologian sitting down, looking through history and saying, oh, I see this thing which was really bad, God actually used that for good. This is a man whose personal torment and suffering was the means that God used to bring good to others. And he's like, yeah, I know you guys meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, and so don't worry. It's like, what? God meant to use this to preserve many people alive, and so of course I'll keep you alive. I'm not going to go against God. I'm not in the place of God. I don't get to decide these things. And I personally forgave you long ago. Have you forgotten my weeping and the dinner we shared together and the times we had and the laughter and all that? Of course, you're forgiven. Don't worry, I'll provide for you. It just represents such an embrace of the providence of God. Like, it's not just a doctrine to be believed. He knew it in his bones. God had meant all this for good, and he didn't hold it against any of them. This is what we mean as Christians when we talk about, learning of God. Like, we don't study theology to get the quiz right. We don't study about God. We don't read about God so that we can know the answers. But we want this stuff in our bones so that it comes out of us. Like, it's like what Peter says. Like, you want to give somebody an answer for the reason, the hope that's in you? It's like, how do you do that? We don't do that by studying stuff to have answers. You do that by, he says, setting apart Christ as Lord in your heart. You sanctify the Lord Jesus Christ as Lord in your heart. You worship God. You serve God. You give God His place. You bow to Him. You let Him do His work in your heart over time, and you get to the place where it just comes out of you. You've got reasons for this hope that's in you. It's not that you read the latest book on apologetics, as helpful as those may or may not be. This is what we're talking about. Joseph was a man who had it in him. You could ask him, why do you hope? Well, let me tell you. Where should I begin? This is what it is. So let's keep reading then. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. So somehow Manasseh must have done something wonderful in his life for Joseph to earn some honor as well. And Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that He swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. His last words, the last recorded words of Joseph: God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. It's amazing. Again, his intention, his desire is to set their hearts on the promises of God and the future God has for them. It was hundreds of years later before that came about. You can imagine if it weren't for these solemn scenes we've read about where these patriarchs of Israel are commending to those that are left and will come after them to look to God and to anticipate this future. Had they not done that, would there have been any in Israel looking? There were few. I mean, they had, in terms of practice, had mostly accepted the practice of the Egyptians and just had these stories that they had kept and were kind of just waiting. It's amazing. All that was necessary that these men do. Their death, these guys can't be around forever. And when they die, what's going to come? Well, they set out before they died to do all they could to make sure those after them would continue believing the things they should believe. It sounds a little bit like Peter, doesn't it? And he says, look, you remember this? He says, I count it as worthwhile to spend all my time reminding you of these basic things. Let me just read from there. In, I don't know if it's 1 Peter or 2 Peter now. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 12. Therefore I intend always to remind you of these qualities, though you know them and are established in the truth that you have. I think it right, as long as I'm in this body, to stir you up by way of reminder, since I know that the putting off of my body will be soon, as our Lord Jesus Christ made clear to me, and I'll make every effort so that after my departure you may be able at any time to recall these things. And this is what these men are doing. Don't forget these promises. Swear to me. You won't forget me or the promises. When the time comes, you'll remember. What are our applications from all this? Number one, when you think of Joseph and his forgiveness and his righteousness, I want to say it this way. The character of an individual believer can and often does advance the program of God in the world. Often when we think of God's program advancing, of souls being won, of cultures being infiltrated with the subversive message of Jesus' lordship and the gospel, we think of action. Missionaries being sent, martyrs dying, this sort of thing, evangelistic activity, compassionate activity. But at this moment in Israel's history, which we've read about, it was personal forgiveness that moved God's program forward. It was just, I forgive you. Of course, I don't hold it against you. That moved the program forward. If he had withheld forgiveness, none of this would have worked. It was the good character of Joseph, almost by itself, that made this possible. Beloved, this was obviously a tremendous day for this family, but it has implications for the entire rest of redemptive history, and we don't often think of things that way. These small actions, like personal forgiveness, are larger than they appear to us. There is a great program of God advancing in the world, but that program advances not mainly on the backs of a few missionaries throughout thousands of years of church history, but rather through the lives of Christians whose significant choices and decisions in this cause of Christ are often unnoticed by us, are heard of by very few, but are precious and necessary in the sight of God. This is how it is. You think of, we can read about, maybe William Carey going to India, and it's like, okay, but what has William Carey done in India in the last several hundred years? It's like almost no effect. And if he had any effect, if he's had any effect, and he has, it's because of the faithfulness, the day-to-day faithfulness of those who came after. It's because of the Christian character of people who were consistent Christians in the midst of a perverse culture for hundreds of years, whose names none of us know. And honestly, if we were told maybe about half of their lives, probably most of us wouldn't even care to know. Until we have the right perspective about these things, and all of a sudden now, that thing that they wouldn't even think to tell you was the thing that opened up this whole avenue to the gospel in this town that, oh, this other Christian that all of us know was because of that. And not that that's the goal, but just understand some things you do know about are because of this little thing that didn't even matter. Didn't seem to matter, but was massively consequential. When our character reflects God's righteousness, when our hands and feet are put to service in the world just as Jesus' were, right? When our tongues are full of God's saving message, when our heart's full of the same loving concern that He had, when our faith and our confidence in God stands in a world that's opposed to us, when our lives are a fragrance of Christ where we go, then in that way the gospel of God permeates the world. And as believers, as priests of God, as ambassadors for Christ, we fill the world with the leaven of the gospel. Character matters. These little things aren't always so little. And then the next thing I wanted to say on this was that death can, and in many ways does, advance the program of God. For Joseph, like his death, what does he do when he dies? He makes sure his voice is added to this growing cloud of witnesses the people of Israel can have, to remember, telling them to remember the promises of God, remember the purposes of God. But also his death was necessary for the program of God because he needed to be forgotten so that they could be treated as slaves in this way. So that in time, as they drifted a bit, the suffering put on them by the hands of Pharaoh would cause them to cry out to God for deliverance. They would look to Him again afresh, down in their soul, crying out to God, in cries that can only be described, or are described at least by God, as having reached the heavens. This is what happened. That wouldn't have happened if if Joseph was around all this time and they were just getting everything handed to them. They wouldn't have been crying out for God for this. They wouldn't have wanted out of Egypt. They barely wanted out as it is. It's amazing. They wouldn't have wanted to leave there. Would you want to leave a place where everything is provided for you and given to you, and you have all the best jobs and all the best land and all the best stuff? Why would you leave? You've got to get them out of there, and it's never going to be that way unless the Egyptians stop regarding Israel for the sake of Joseph. I got to kill Joseph, and God kills him in his old age. And the people go on and they suffer, and then they cry out to God, and God sends a deliverer, and they come back. But it's all He can do to get them to want to get out of slavery even. It's amazing. Joseph had to go. He served the purposes of God in his generation. He did. Was mightily used by God, but he had to be taken off the scene or things couldn't have happened. It's like the disciples. Jesus can tell them, it's better for you that I would leave. And we think, it can't possibly be better. It's better. Just trust Him when He says that. It's better. You say, well, we need you. He says, you don't need me. I'm going to send someone to help you. This Comforter, I'll send Him. And He's got much work He's going to do in you and through you in the world. Believe me, this is better. It's amazing. For the believer who dies in faith, death is a painful move towards something better, to be with Christ. For Christians who lose a loved one, it's a painful reminder of how temporary this present world is. And that's a good thing for us, right? To be reminded of that again and again. These things can be shaken, but there's a city of God and a future hope that cannot be shaken. God is the builder and the architect of that future. For the unbeliever, here's an unbeliever, and they witness just someone dying, the death of a Christian. It's a testimony of God's faithfulness and a demonstration of the peace that passes understanding when they see the way Christians respond to this death. Someone dying as a martyr. It's a necessary price of announcing the lordship of Jesus Christ to His subjects who have so far been disloyal and hostile. That's the price of announcing His lordship. Carrying His work forward. For the world, when it witnesses the death of an unbeliever, If they have eyes to see, they see this as a loud testimony of the emptiness and the frailty of life for those who don't know God. In all these ways, an individual's death serves the purposes of God in the world. The death of the Lord Jesus Christ, certainly the ultimate serving the purposes of God with the death. What a thing. Even what Scripture calls the second death, when the world itself will be rid of all sin and sinners, when the living and the dead will be judged by God, and hell itself will be cast into an eternal place of wrath and justice called the lake of fire. All people whose names having not been written down in God's book of life, what happens? Cast away. Forever cast away by the risen King. The earth will be remade. God's dwelling place will once again be here with man. But this requires this second death. All these things need to be brought to an end in order to have this what's going to be new. These are some of the ways that death advances the kingdom and the purpose of God. And we see it with Joseph and with Jacob, but with Joseph especially. So those are some of the lessons we can draw in all this. These closing chapters of Genesis, chapters 48, 49, and 50. That's all I have today. Hopefully this review was a help. You remember kind of the thrust of these chapters again and what we can take with us from them. Any questions or comments on anything that was here?